it's both. It is August 8th, and I have started my August reading. So it is time to start my August vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These videos are ones that I make every month where I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to the time that I've read them as I can. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes. I tell you something about the books, I tell you what I thought of them. You know, maybe you'd want to read them. Maybe you've already read them. Maybe we can discuss them in the comments below. The first book that I finished in August was House of Blues, which is a Skip Langdon novel by Julie Smith. So Skip Langdon is a New Orleans police detective, and this is the fifth or sixth book in the series. I have read 1 through whatever it is, 5 or 6. I'm trying to read these in order, but I think after this one I'm kind of in a standstill with the books that I have. I think I'm gonna have to start skipping around again. Skip Langdon is an interesting character because she was an uptown girl. She comes from a rich family in New Orleans, and she has the privileges of being a white rich person in New Orleans. She goes against her family by becoming a police officer, and she goes against her family by not wanting to luxuriate in their privilege and more wanting to help others, to be good for others. And in the very beginning of this series, we see her as just like a regular beat cop. She gets promoted to homicide. We learn about different people, her kind of like arch nemesis on the force, who she is forced to work with early on, and then also like her captain who comes on, who is really great, and the I don't know the names of cops, the superintendent or whatever, who's her friend and who kind of looks out for her. In House of Blues, we see her once again going off on a murder investigation. She is called to a rich family's house where a murder has taken place. A man had been having dinner with his family, but now is lying dead in his dining room, and his daughter, his granddaughter, and his son-in-law are missing. So Skip has to figure out who this man is. She talks to his wife, who is the person who found him, and deals with that. And it turns out that this is a very high-class family who owns a well-known, well-renowned restaurant in New Orleans, and that plays into the family dynamic. And we see that family dynamic as we meet the brother of the family, as we meet the assistant to the patriarch who was murdered, and as we learn about the family business of being in the restaurant. So these books are interesting because Skip is a very open person, but she does have a lot of ingrained prejudice, and so that does come out. There's always a little bit of tension with race relation in here, and the idea that a lot of the times that Skip is looking for a murderer or a criminal, she is looking on the bad side of town. She's looking at the black people in the neighborhood. She is looking at the non-white people, and a lot of these crimes do have to do with upper white middle class or upper class people. And then of course, like, there is some entanglement, and so Skip does, I think, understand some of the relevance of that and the wealth discrepancy and the idea of the budding up of the impoverished and the very rich, and the different cultures that exist in New Orleans, not just black and white culture, but cultures within those cultures. I think Julie Smith always tries to do a good job of like portraying a lot of different people. I do think these books were written in the 90s, so there's definitely some verbiage, some language, some characteristics of people that are pointed out that are not necessarily appropriate today and are not necessarily done in a good way. Skip is often talked about how she's like so huge. She's like 5'11", and she's just like a giant person, and like they call her like a linebacker and like all this stuff. They're just like, she's just a lady, like it's not that big of a deal. But you know, so there is some of that Julie Smith falls into that is kind of its time and of its place, and you kind of have to skip over. But there's a lot of interesting things about race. There's a lot of interesting things about gender and sexuality in all these books. Skip's best friend is queer, and like her boyfriend and he don't necessarily get along, so there's always some like question about that. The best friend is raising his sister's 2 kids, so there's always a little bit of conversation about that. And then like within whatever the crime is. There's usually some talk about all of those topics as well. Also other things. But like also these are just like 90s cop books. So they're also like mafia is getting involved and like all this weird stuff is happening, and they're always going to like the projects and there's like a drug deal. You know, there's always some very 90s thing. But I really love these books, and I liked House of Blues. Something that Julie Smith does that I don't love in some of these books is she follows some of the secondary and tertiary characters in certain chapters. So like in this one, there's something happened to this family in their past that could have relevance on the crime today. One of the chapters that we get kind of often is from the brother's perspective. These are all third person, but like we follow the brother and he's writing, and in his writing, he's writing in first person, and like that can get kind of tedious. She's done that in other books as well, but especially in this one, I think the build up to the thing, which she keeps calling it the thing that happened to this family, is kind of like, wah-wah. I mean, it's a bad thing, obviously, and it does have relevance on the case, but it's not like, I don't know, she just builds it up to be this like kind of ridiculous thing, but then she's dealing with like much, much harder topics in other aspects of the book, so I don't know. I don't love that she follows other people and we get perspectives of like kidnapped people or people who are missing. We get perspectives of the potential criminals. I don't love that. I kind of would rather see everything from Skip's perspective and be able to try and figure out the mystery from Skip's perspective. I also don't think these are mystery books that you can figure out the mystery, which I don't mind. I'm happy to just be along for the ride. But I was super glad to get this one, and I will definitely continue on with the series. She has quite a few more, and in this one I was really interested because they didn't mention Katrina. Obviously that hadn't happened. It doesn't happen for another like 20 years or something, but she mentioned a storm, or there was something going on that made me think of Katrina, and I was like, wow, these are going to be really interesting when we get to Katrina and some of the other tropical storms and some of the other hurricanes that they've had that have maybe not as badly decimated the city. So I think that's going to be really fascinating to follow Skip's journey like into the present day. I don't think Julie Smith is still making these, but I think there was one as recently as like 2016. The next book that I finished in August was Jackrabbit Skim by Ivy Pochada. This is a very short story. It was an hour and 25 minutes. Actually, that's one of the longer short stories for those. I read this one on audio, and I have never read anything by this author before. Jackrabbit Skim is about a woman who breaks up with her husband and moves out to the desert, I believe, in California. It could have been Arizona, but I think it was California. She starts life anew in this kind of isolated, insular desert town where her friends have a vacation home. So they're not using it, and they're like, sure, go out there and you can live out there. You can, pay us a little bit of rent. Our main character is a tattoo artist, and so she's always constantly doing like hashtags and desert scenes and different things on her Instagram and her TikTok, partly because it's her business to display images and to show her work. So she's like tattooing herself, she's tattooing other people, and she kind of has a very like tenuous foothold in this town where she goes to the local bar and she works on her sketches, and she kind of knows the bartender and he seems kind of cool, but she still gets like kind of an ominous vibe from a lot of the townspeople. Then she notices that the house next door to hers, which is a little bit of ways away, has burnt down, and someone is walking around in this burnt down house at night. So she starts to get a little creeped out. She finds out that the man who used to live there still lives on a trailer on the property, and one day this man confronts her in the bar, and this kind of sets off a series of things that happen which lead her to learn more about why that house burned down, lead her to learn more about this man, and we as the reader kind of go along with this mystery to find out what's going on. It was good. I liked it. It was a little long. It could have been shorter, I think. It could have been more concise. There was a little bit of repetition that wasn't needed. I think some of the shocking moments or the tense moments would have been made more exciting if it had been shorter and happened in like a more concise amount of time. But I did enjoy it, and I do have a Ivy Pochada, I don't know if that's how you say that author's name, on my TBR, and it did make me want to read that, and so I think I'll probably read that one on audio. The next book that I finished in August is Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. I also read this one on audio. I've had this one for a while. I wanted this one because I saw it as an NYRB edition and it sounded really interesting. 47-year-old Lolly Willows is a conventional maiden aunt. So it talks about how she is kind of a spinster and then she becomes a witch, which it kind of says on the back. But the majority of this book is really about Lolly's early life, about her life as a child, what kind of young person she was, and then her relationship with her parents, her relationship with her brother, and when her parents pass away, how her brothers pass her off back and forth between them, like she was living in the family home, but her brother is going to move in with his family and he doesn't want her, so she goes to the other brother. Throughout this story, we see Lolly evolving as a person and how she is really bucking tradition and how she is really getting away with things like educating herself and becoming an educated woman and having her own wants and needs and desires, but also her own creative outlets and her own career and her own life, and how she's very resentful about supposedly being this spinster aunt and about the requirements and the responsibilities that she supposedly has, and how people keep like bothering her and nagging her to do the things that she's supposed to do. She then decides that she's going to move out of her brother's house, live on her own, take what she has that was left to her by her parents, and live the life that she wants to lead. But that really happens kind of at the end of the book, and then that is kind of where the witchy elements come. It's a little bit of a extreme turn to those elements. Like the majority of the book is kind of a comedy of manners, kind of a satirical look at family life and how families are supposed to be, and the idea that women were supposed to be a certain way, but they don't need to be that way. This book was originally written in 1926, and Townsend lived from 1893 to 1978. It's definitely a late 1800s, early 1900s English version of what women should be, and it's a little bit of a feminist look at that and how it's pretty dumb. But then the end, it kind of takes like a strong turn towards those witchy elements, and it ends on kind of an ambiguous note, which I really, really liked. Again, maybe this book could have even been shorter, even though this book is like only 155 pages. I think maybe if that first part had been shortened and then the end part not extended, but I think it would have made more of a punch at the end if it had been a little bit more like tight and a little bit more concise. But written in 1926, you know, this book did remind me of The Great God Pan and of The White People. So similar elements to that kind of supernatural, unclear, but then also how people are supposed to behave, the juxtaposition of those two things. So I really did enjoy this one. This is one that I could maybe see reading again. Townsend Warner has a very like lyrical, lilting, kind of fun way of writing. It definitely reminds me of like P.G. Wodehouse, and not as comic as that, but some of my other favorite early 1900 British writers or Irish writers or Welsh writers. It reminds me of all that. So it was a nice one to read. I enjoyed it. And I would definitely read more from that author because I would be interested to see like what other feminist themes she has in her other works. The next book I read on audio, and it was Apartment Women by Gyu Byung-mo. I read one other book by this woman, which was The Old Woman and the Knife, which is actually kind of a thrilling espionage genre book where we follow a elderly woman assassin. She's like in her late 60s or early 70s. In Apartment Women, we follow an apartment full of women. So we follow all these different women who are living in this government subsidized housing outside of Seoul. And it's specifically a place where rent is a little bit cheaper, but they require you to do certain things. And one of the requirements is to try to have at least 3 children. So one of the government requirements is to like up the birth rate great. The opening of this book is a new family, a wife, a father, and a little bit older daughter coming to live at this apartment building, and right off the bat we get a little bit of weird vibes. The other people in the apartment building seem like overly interested in these people and what they're doing, and the wife is a little bit annoyed because she commutes into Seoul, she drives, and the father stays home with the daughter, and she feels the pressure of like that this is abnormal and that this is not the way that families are necessarily supposed to be constructed, and she feels a little bit like put upon by these questions from the other people. And then we see the different lives of the different women living there and how they might be happy with their lot, how they might be unhappy with their lot, the different things that they do. And I think the different way that all these women don't fit into traditional society, either within their own consciousness, within their own minds, or outwardly, like this kind of main character that we have, which is the woman who commutes into Seoul. Just odd things start happening. Like definitely our main character starts thinking about all the paperwork she had to sign and all the different requirements that this housing facility had and like why that would be, and she, you know, is definitely getting a little bit creeped out by it. And at the same time, one of the other husband's cars break down, so she ends up driving him into Seoul, and that becomes a whole thing. And then we see other women who are struggling as well. It's not a genre book, it's not an unsettling book, it's definitely much more in the vein of Kim Ji-young, born 1986, I think that book is called. More of a feminist novel, definitely more of a look at the changing culture of women's lives in Korea. It's definitely very modern, and it has some modern references, which is nice. But there is like an undercurrent of unsettlement through the whole thing and some strange things going on. Not strange like Lolly Willows, not strange like paranormal or supernatural, but just unsettling and a little bit disturbing. So I did really like this one. I loved The Old Woman with the Knife. I thought that was really good. It reminds me a little bit of this, the idea of like women should be a certain way, but the internal monologues and the internal thought processes of these women and how times are changing in these cultures at these times. But I really loved The Old Woman with a Knife, whereas Apartment Women, even though it had all those themes as well, just didn't strike me quite as much. I would definitely continue to read more from this author. As far as I know, all the books that they have that are translated are really short, and I just really enjoyed them. The next book that I finished in August is Love, Pamela. I specifically read Pamela Anderson's memoir because of the whole Pamela Anderson, Liam Neeson thing, which I am like loving right now. It's like making my heart full. I saw this TikTok post or something about how maybe this is the start of like the turnaround of life for us in America. Like maybe this is a bastion of joy and happiness that is to come, and hopefully that's true. I don't believe it, but I hope that that is true. And I've always loved Pamela Anderson. I have always loved Pamela Anderson since Barbed Wire and since, what was that TV show she did? Not Baywatch, not when she was the Tool Time Girl. She had another show that me and my friend used to watch. He went to college in Washington, D.C., and we would call and talk about it, and we just loved it. And I've just always enjoyed Pamela Anderson's antics and her celebrity status and how much she cares about sustainability and about ethical animal practices, works with PETA. I've also really, really enjoyed following her no makeup journey and her kind of resurgence into acting, and I think that's really great. I haven't seen her latest movies, but I definitely plan on seeing The Last Showgirl or whatever that is. But I read Love, Pamela for GarbAugust because it is GarbAugust. I was thinking about it, and I think House of Blues could count for GarbAugust too, because it just has those very like tropey, cliche cop things. And Love, Pamela, even though, you know, it's a legit memoir, I think counts as, I think all celebrity memoirs count as GarbAugust. So Love, Pamela is told by Pamela Anderson in her own words and in her own voice on the audiobook, and she just tells you about her life growing up in Canada, her relationship with her mother and her brother and her father, and her parents' relationship and how it was very tumultuous. She talks a lot about her childhood and about growing up and about being a tomboy, but being sexualized at an extremely young age. She talks about being abused by a babysitter. She talks about being sexually assaulted as a 13-year-old. She might have even been younger than that. She talks about being raped as a young woman. She kind of glosses over a lot of those things, and you can tell that she has gone to therapy for them, that she has worked through some of them, but they're still not something that she dwells on. And I don't think that she intended this memoir to be about that. I think those just are things that shaped her life. She dwells more on her inner growth and her growth as a person. And actually, it reminds me a little bit of Lolly Willows too, in that Pamela was always thought of to be one thing, one kind of woman, and that she really had to find her own way, to learn her own way, despite people's feelings on her. She's extremely well read, she loves poetry, she loves philosophy, and Pamela knows that people don't believe that about her, and at every turn people are surprised that she's not just some dumb, vapid bimbo. And certainly she has that like Marilyn Monroe thing where her voice kind of sounds like that, like what you would expect. Obviously no voice is vapid by inception, but like especially to American minds, that is what we think of. That kind of high, lilting, sweet voice is often associated with those things. And obviously her beautiful, good looks and her curvy figure and her big lips are also associated with vapidness and with unintelligence, whereas Pamela is a deeply intelligent and spiritual and empathetic person. It's interesting to think about. So it's interesting to hear that from her and hear her own story and think about my perceptions of her and how I don't know a lot or didn't know a lot about her as a person ever in my entire life, but I feel an affinity to her or a attraction to her or an appreciation of her as a artist, like as a celebrity. Celebrities to me are like fictional characters almost, and that is something that Pamela talks about, how she often created for herself her persona as a celebrity, as a fictional character, and got to try out things that weren't necessarily ingrained in her or that weren't necessarily a intuitive part of her personality. So I think it's interesting. I just think the whole idea of celebrity is interesting, and I like the way she talked about it. I did think that the glossing over of some of her personal tragedy or some of her personal experiences made it seem superficial. And not that she only talked about good things, but when you don't talk in depth about bad things or when you don't talk in depth about hard things, sometimes it makes it seem like those things are not true, which is also an interesting perception to think about, and why do we think that in this society and in this culture. But she didn't talk about anything like super in depth. This audiobook was only like 5 hours. The book is very short. It was more just kind of like a glimpse into her mind and to her philosophy on life and her experiences that she's had, rather than like an in-depth memoir. And I liked it, and I would read more by her, and I will continue to like her as a celebrity, and I hope her and Liam Neeson are very happy together. The next book that I read in August was Lemonade Serenade, or The Thing in the Garden. This is a children's book that I picked up recently. I mostly picked it up for this end paper because I think this is so beautiful, and I want to try and emulate this with like watercolors and markers. I think this would be so cool. And the illustrations all together are very pretty. I think I've read this one before. There's definitely some imagery in this that is familiar to me. I think I got this at the Goodwill for 99 cents. Just some cool pictures. The story itself is about a woman and a young boy who always have tea in the garden, and then one day they get scared out of the garden, and then they figure out why they got scared out of the garden, and they make a new friend. And it was very cute. The next book that I finished in August is Wolf in a White Van by John Darnell. I've read one other John Darnell, and I love The Mountain Goats. I went to see The Mountain Goats, and that was partly what inspired me to pick this book up. I read Universal Harvester, I think it was called, which is interesting because that title doesn't really go with the book, and this title doesn't really go with the book either. I mean, they both are said in those books, but they don't encapsulate what the book is about. You know, they're just a random set of words that are in the book. I think Wolf in a White Van was written first. In this book, we follow Sean, who we find out right away has had a severe accident that has disfigured his face, has caused him a lot of trouble and trauma, and it's hard for him to do things on his own, and it's hard for people to look at him. So even the things that he can do on his own, he's limited in because he is so horribly disfigured, and it is so disturbing to people. And then as we read more through the book, we kind of learn about Sean's life as it is now after the accident. We learn about things leading up to the accident. We learn about things just after the accident. We learn about the accident itself. And it kind of goes backward in time from like now to the inciting incident to the accident as we progress through the book. But within that, and interspersed with that, we get glimpses of a game that Sean has made. And one of the things that he did while he was in the hospital was create this RPG where he has created this world, this desert, post-apocalyptic world. And it is a physical RPG where people send in money and make moves via letter writing. So you read about this game in the back of a newspaper or of a magazine. Sean loves sci-fi, so it's like in sci-fi magazines. And then you write in with your character. And then Sean takes you on different moves for this character. So he'll say, okay, your character does this. Do you want to do X, Y, or Z? And then you write back and say, oh, I do Z. A lot of this book is about how the game works and what the game is like and what is going on in the game and how Sean thought of the game and how the game has had real life consequences for Sean and for other people. So those chapters are kind of interspersed with the chapters of Sean's current life, and at the same time we're seeing flashbacks to leading back to the accident. So it was really interesting. It takes a little while to get into. I read this one on audio. I think if I'd read it physically, it would have become more apparent what was going on quicker. Obviously, I do have the physical copy, so I did look through it as well, but it's not divided in a very specific way. So the chapters of the game don't say the game, you know, they don't tell you what's going on. They just go into it. The past chapters don't tell you that they're in the past. They just go into chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. Like, you just have to figure it out. So I think it would have been less confusing physically, but still a little bit confusing physically. And we just get to know Sean and like his reasonings behind all the different things. I really liked learning about the game. I really liked the different things that happened outside of the game but pertaining to the game. I don't know, it was just a really interesting book. It took me a little while to get into, but I think it's definitely worth it. It's one of those ones where you're just dropped into the middle of everything. You're dropped into the middle of 3 different things: Sean in the present, Sean in the past, and the game. So you really have to like go along with it to figure out what's going on, but I really enjoyed it. I liked Universal Harvester as well, and that had a similar feel in that it was about a young man living in the Midwest, the hopelessness of that, the hopelessness of being a young man in general, the untethered feeling that these young men had. That one was definitely more overtly creepy and more horror, but this is kind of a psychological creeping horror as well, just a much lower level. Like Universal Harvester has some like actually scary moments that you're like nervous and freaked out. This was more like a different kind of horror, a more mental horror. This book did remind me a little bit of Invisible Monsters in certain aspects, and I know it was written way after that, so I wonder if it was partially inspired by that. I also think that this does sound a lot more like lyrics from the Mountain Goats in certain places than Universal Harvester did. So I'm interested to read Devil House, which I also have by John Darnell, especially because Universal Harvester and Wolf in a White Van are basically the same size, which I think is perfect. I think both of these were the absolute perfect length. Devil House is much, much longer, so I worry that it won't be perfect. Those are the first 7 books that I've read in August, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. I could swear that for like a hot minute, Storygraph didn't have, when you went to the stats page, it didn't have a place where you could like look at all your books listed out, but now it does again. So if I was wrong, that's fine. If I'm crazy, that's fine. But if It's back. I'm glad. It is August 13th, and the next book that I finished in August was Black Flame by Gretchen Falker Martin. This is a proof copy that I found in a little free library. It was weird because there's little free libraries that I frequent in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, which is the town close to mine. There was a bunch of copies of these. There was like 3 copies of this and a couple of other ones that I picked up. So someone is getting proofs. I don't know if they won prizes, you know, Goodreads giveaway, or if they got them from the publisher, or if they have something to do with the publication, which I guess theoretically they could. But I was super happy to find this. I've never read any Gretchen Felker Martin before, but I am interested in her horror. This is about Ellen, who is a approaching middle-aged young Jewish woman. What are you doing? What are you doing? This is about Ellen, who is a approaching middle-aged young Jewish woman in Brooklyn in the 1980s, and she works at a film restoration company that is like notorious for doing not cool films. So she worked on films having to do with like the KKK and various other bad things, and the people that she works for are not cool. Her life is like kind of falling apart, and she's not really at the stage that she thinks that she should be at, or certainly not that her family thinks that she should be at in life. So she's kind of sleepwalking through life a lot of the time, but she gets the opportunity to work on The Black Flame, which is a film that was reportedly lost during the Nazi occupation of Germany, and it is supposedly a satanic film with lots of different gross and gory, sexual, weird, deviant things, and supposedly this film was lost, but then was miraculously found, and somehow this little tiny weird film company has got its hands on it. So Ellen starts working on this film, and as soon as she does, she starts to become haunted by the things that are on this film, that are in this film, and possibly mentally, but possibly actually haunted as well. We learn her history through her feelings of working on this film and through her experience working on this film, and we learn that she had a girlfriend in college. Her parents basically like made her give that up and sent her to, sent her to a place that stamps out your gayness, and now she's better, but like her life is basically like meaningless. She does do some things, like she helps a homeless woman who is on her way to work. She brings her a paper, she brings her cigarettes, she brings her food, and she forms a connection with her, but we see that she really doesn't have a connection with anyone else. Her parents set her up on dates, and she goes on them, and she has sex with men, but she really doesn't like it or appreciate it, and she doesn't want to continue doing it. And one of the things that happens in this book is one man kind of becomes attached to her. So unfortunately, we see Ellen go through even more trauma, the trauma of having to give up her girlfriend, having to lose what she thinks of as the love of her life, having to lose her identity as a queer person, having to continually lose the person she thinks she is, and she feels she is, and she knows she is because of how women are treated in society. And then also having to deal with this man. There's sexual assault, there's gaslighting, there's a whole bunch of terrible things in this, and the whole time and the whole backdrop of it is the film and the nefarious, weird, bizarre, violent things that are happening with this film. I thought this was really bad. I thought this was not well written. I thought it's a proof, so you have to give it a little bit of leeway for being a little bit jumbled, for not being super clear, for having actual grammatical mistakes and spelling mistakes and things like that. But I understand what they were trying to do with the themes of the haunted film, but the nature of the film and the nature of the violence, like, I get it. I get the allegory of that to queerness and to transness, because there is trans storylines in this book as well. But it just didn't work. It didn't make sense. It wasn't cohesive. There were aspects where it referenced something that was referencing like the film, but it seemed like it was referencing something in her life, and it was unclear what that was. At one point they talk about a presence in her house, and you don't know if that's an actual presence or not. Like, I get that that could have been intentionally vague, but it wasn't well executed. It was not a good book. It had a very interesting premise. It had a lot of interesting things that I understand it was trying to say about queerness, about society, about transness, but it didn't work. It didn't do it well, and it didn't make very much sense. The writing is just not good. There's a lot of purple prose, there's a lot of over explanation of everything, but I came away from this book, I read this book physically, not having a clear visual on anything. There's a couple of instances where Felker Martin makes a scene from her writing that is clear in your mind, but only like one or two throughout a very heavily descriptive book. So like there's a ton of description, but there's no nuance. There's no actual spark in your brain of what's actually going on, and I just thought it was bad. I thought it was really poorly written. I'm not going to read it again, but I would be interested to see if the finished copy fixed some of those continuity problems and some of those issues with it being unclear what's happening. Obviously, anytime you're dealing with a haunting, anytime you're dealing with topics of potential otherworldly things, not clear if someone is mad or something is actually happening, there's going to be a little confusion, and you want that, right? But this was not that. This was just poorly written. So I'm really disappointed. I'm really sad because I was excited for this book and I was excited for Felker Martin's writing in general. I do still plan to pick up another of her books, maybe Manhunt, which is her most well-known, her debut, I believe. But I don't hold out much hope anymore. If you like haunted film stories, there was a lot of gory horror in this, so if you like that, you might as well read this one, but I just didn't think it was doing anything super innovative or super interesting or super amazing, and I don't think the things that it was doing well. So it's a no for me, but it was short, so you could certainly pick it up and give it a try. The next book that I finished in August was Olga Dies Dreaming, which is the debut of this author who, I meant to look up how you say their name, but they are a Latinx author, I believe, of Puerto Rican descent. And Olga Dies Dreaming is about Olga, who is also an American Latinx woman of Puerto Rican descent. And this story follows Olga. She is a wedding planner and she's really, really good at her job. She likes her job and she likes what she does, but even in the very beginning of this book, we're seeing that she's a little fed up with the confines of being a woman in America and the confines of what society is making her do and having her do. It takes place a little bit in the past, but then we do get up to like 2021 or 2022 at some point. So we start in like 2017, but we do see flashbacks to Olga's childhood, and we learn all about Olga's brother, who is a politician, and we learn about her family life. Her father is dead. He's passed away from HIV and AIDS because he was an intravenous drug user, and her mother is on the lam. So her mother became a Puerto Rican freedom fighter. Early on in Olga and her brother's life, left the family. The only contact that Olga and her brother have with their mom is letters that she sends them. So interspersed in this book, there are letters sent from their mother. It's all about Olga kind of realizing who she is and coming into her own and releasing herself from the shackles that everyone else has put on her. So what her mother's expectations were, what her grandmother's expectations were, what her expectations were, what society's expectations were, and the same can be said of her brother. Her brother is doing the same thing. Throughout this, we learn more about Olga and her brother, about their relationship. There's a love story that runs through this with Olga, but there is a lot of stuff in this book that happens. So there is sexual assault, there is rape, there is being outed, there is queerness, there is being closeted, there is self-internalized homophobia and racism. I thought it was a really interesting book. I read this book on audio, and I'm glad that I did because I do not think I could have gotten through it if I had read it physically. I didn't love that there were many multiple narrators for the audio book, but it did kind of work here, and as always, ways, if there are going to be multiple narrators and there are going to be multiple first-person perspectives, or you're seeing from multiple perspectives, I don't like when it's like one of Olga, one of her brother, one of their mom's letters. Like, I need it to be broken up in different ways and less methodic than that, and it was, which I appreciated. I think there were a lot of interesting themes running through this, and throughout the whole book there was commentary on Puerto Rico and the tragedies that have happened in Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico being an American, whatever they call it. They don't call it a state, but they call it like whatever. And so that was really interesting, but it felt very dry and it felt very intentionally inserted, but not well blended with the rest of the story. And I think that kind of all comes down to this being a debut. So I think the debut writing is pretty apparent in this one, and some of that clunkiness and some of that separation of story and theme is obvious because it's a debut. So I'm super excited to see what this author does next, because I think that that will have smoothed out a lot. But overall, I liked it. I liked the little love story running through. I liked that it was like almost had vibes of a romance. Another thing that I both liked and disliked about this book was that it's set in Brooklyn, and it's set specifically in Sunset Park, which is a heavily Latinx community, and it felt very much like, look at this thing that I know about. It didn't feel exactly like this person lived there. Like, maybe the author lived there for a while, but it felt more like they became enamored of this place, learned a lot about it, and is now preaching to you, telling you. And it felt the same way about Puerto Rico in some ways. But specifically about Brooklyn, it had a lot of like, look, I know Brooklyn. Like, I know Brooklyn. Like, I know Sunset Park. I know this area. I think for me, I enjoyed that because I do know that area, and because I do love Brooklyn, and I love books about Brooklyn, and I love books that are obviously written by someone who loves Brooklyn. But I don't think it would have translated well to someone who doesn't know Brooklyn and doesn't care. I don't think that the way that Brooklyn was talked about, and Sunset Park specifically was talked about, was engaging and enticing to a reader who doesn't understand Brooklyn. Again, I think that is probably chalked up to this being a debut. I liked it, and I would say that if you liked familial stories, if you liked stories of people finding themselves later in life, if you like stories of family resilience, I would definitely give this one a whirl. It is August 14th, and I think I just updated you yesterday, but I never finished. The next book that I read in August was The Knight and the Butcher Bird by Alex E. Harrow. So this is a short story, and this is the second Alex E. Harrow that I read. I also read The 10,000 Doors of January, which I really liked. I did enjoy The 10,000 Doors of January. It was a little too angsty for me. It was a little too YA, but The Knight and the Butcher Bird I thought was really, really great. I know that many people think that Alex E. Harrow excels at short stories, and this was one of the longer of those short stories at an hour and 15 minutes on audio. I was able to read this at 1.75 or maybe 2 times speed though, so it went really quickly, and I just thought it was really great. I love that Alex E. Harrow's worlds that she creates are very diverse in everything. They're diverse in ethnicity, they're diverse in skill, they're diverse in gender, they're diverse in sexuality. Like, I love that the worlds that she has are the amalgamation of like what you would want to see in a world in many respects. The Knight and the Butcher Bird is a post-apocalyptic cli-fi tale, cautionary tale, I guess, of a young woman who is like a scholar. She's like the teller in her community. She's the person who gathers information and tells the information to the town and remembers the stories from the past, especially in this kind of long past normal civilization, long past civilization as we know it time period. She is the scholar who tells everyone, so the past is not repeated. But we come to find out that she's just recently taken this position because because the scholar before her passed away. So we are learning about that. We're learning slowly about the world and what happened to the world. And this is set in like Appalachia. So they're in this holler, and kind of how each holler or each place has their own community and their own whatever. But something that's been plaguing the entire world is that people have been turning into monsters. Whether it's a plague, whether it's a mutation, whether it's whatever, they don't know. But at some point you start growing feathers, you start growing fangs, you start growing horns, and you become a monster, a creature, no longer a person who can be within the community. So they kill you. And the people that kill you are the knights. When we first meet our main character, she is welcoming a knight to kill one of these monsters that's appeared. But as the story goes on, we find out that there's more than meets the eye to all of these people, and we find out what is going on in these hollers, in these communities, in these places, and how maybe our knight and butcherbird are going to change what happens from here on out. So it was really, really great. It was very punchy. It was very exciting. There was action. There was violence. There was horror. There was love. It made me tear up. It was gay, which is great. It was queer. I love that. It reminded me a lot of the short story that I read by, who's the one who did Harrow the Night? Tasman Muir. It reminded me of the short story that I read by Tasman Muir. That one was great as well, and it had a similar vibe in that, like, there was a lot of reveals, there was a lot of action. It was called Undercover. That was great, and I loved it, and I also loved The Knight and the Butcherbird, so I would highly recommend. The next book that I read so far in August was Abscond by Abraham Verghese. So this is another one of those short stories, but a longer one. It's an hour and 16 minutes on audio, and I did read this one at 2 times speed. It is about a young man growing up in the 60s in New Jersey, which was exciting. He's a young teenager, and he plays tennis, and his Indian Pakistani family, I can't remember actually if they are actually Indian or not, from India, but the heritage that they are from, and his parents being first generation immigrants to America and to New Jersey, plays a large part in this story about how his parents have certain expectations for him and want him to do certain things. And this story is about the young man's relationship with his mother and father, and how those relationships are different and those expectations are different. Then we see a tragedy that befalls the family and how the family members react. I like the writing okay. I thought it was interesting. I liked that it was set in New Jersey. I liked that the story seemed to go one direction and then change direction, and then we saw kind of what this story was actually about. It was overall a fairly quiet story and really a coming of age story of this young man. I don't think it necessarily needed to be set in the 60s, except that there is a lot of talk about how his mother is much more traditional and his father, who is a doctor, had to kind of relearn or at least reschool himself upon moving to America, which was interesting. But overall, I thought it was okay. I would read more from this author, but I don't know. It was a little like drawn out even for a short story, so I don't know if I would want to read longer work. I know that this author is more well known for their longer work. The Covenant of Water, which is 724 pages, I think was like in a Goodreads Choice Award or something. That's too long for me. He has one called Cutting for Stone, which is over 500 pages. Not for me. I would read more short works from this author. And when I read some more in August, I will let you know. Editing Mo here to say that this video got really long somehow. I don't know if I'm just yapping too much or what, so I am going to go ahead and break this into 2 parts. So thank you for watching part 1. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here, and join me for part 2 in just a few days. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one very soon. Bye.